So maritime operations, they form the circulatory system of global trade. Roughly 90% of internationally traded goods move via the ocean or the sea, which is an astonishing figure that underscores how dependent modern economies are efficient and resilient.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Crisis Lab podcast, where we are going to deep dive a little bit more into global crisis management, response strategies, and resilience planning. I'm your host, Kyle, and today I'm joined by our special guest, James Merten, who's going to help us explore the complex world of maritime disruptions and their far-reaching impacts in our globalized society. So James is an expert in maritime crisis management, bringing years of experience and insight to our conversation today, and we'll be discussing a number of wide-ranging topics, but things like ocean shipping and how that carries over 90% of world trade and making maritime operations crucial to our global economy and our daily lives. And so in today's episode, we'll examine how maritime crises unfold, the challenges of coordinating a response across multiple jurisdictions, and innovative approaches to building resilience in this vital sector. So we'll explore everything from governance frameworks to practical on-the-ground operations during emergencies. Whether you're a seasoned maritime professional, policymaker, or just curious about this topic and how global shipping affects your daily life, stay tuned as we discuss this and more with James and his insights that will change how you think about crisis management on the high seas itself. So, James, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thanks, Kyle. I'm really happy to be here.
So before we dive into some questions and things like that and start unpacking this area of expertise, maybe just a quick background about who you are and where you're coming from.
Yeah, thanks for that. My name is James Merten. I'm a port security specialist for recovery and salvage, and I work for the United States Coast Guard as a civilian. And I'm also a PhD student at the University of Antwerp. And at this moment, I'm combining my practical experience with my work that I do with the Coast Guard with academic experience. And I'm also able to get global experience by going to school in Belgium.
All right, great. That's quite the international education. And so, as with all of our podcasts, the guests on our show are basically expressing their own personal opinions and sharing insights and perspectives and are not representative of our organizations and other things like that. I think everybody knows the deal now. We're just interested in sharing perspectives and experience on the Crisis Lab podcast. So let's start with the basics. Many listeners might not realize how maritime operations affect their everyday lives. I think we have a general working assumption, because of the pandemic, and we've seen like the blockage of the Suez Canal and discussions about the Panama Canal in recent months. But could you give us a snapshot of why ports and the broader maritime world are so crucial and why disruptions there actually ripple through everything from the price of coffee to the availability of phone chargers, for example?
Yeah, great question. So maritime operations, they form the circulatory system of global trade. Roughly 90% of internationally traded goods move via the ocean or the sea, which is an astonishing figure that underscores how dependent modern economies are efficient and resilient maritime logistics. Ports are not just sites of cargo transfer, they're also intermodal gateways where goods and services and labor and capital all converge. The average consumer might not realize that the components of their smartphone may have crossed 3 continents before assembly. The coffee we drink may be sourced from Latin America, transported through the Panama Canal, and arrive at a North American port before reaching the shelf. This vast interconnected network is highly efficient, but also vulnerable to disruption. When maritime systems are interrupted, whether due to natural hazards like hurricanes, labor disputes, even cybersecurity breaches, or regulatory delays, the ripple effects cascade rapidly. A delay at a single transshipment hub in Asia or on the west coast of the United States can disrupt factory assembly lines in the Midwest or retail stock levels across Europe. These disruptions not only increase the cost of goods, but also challenge the just-in-time inventory systems that we all see today, affecting everything from industrial output to consumer choice. So, in essence, maritime operations underpin the reliability and affordability of modern life.
And I think that there's a reference point for most people understanding the pandemic and the effects of the pandemic. And then we probably broadly recall the Suez Canal being blocked. But, there's also the aspect of when people hear maritime crisis, you might think of also about the pirate situation around the Horn of Africa or oil spills that are in the news. But what actually counts as a maritime crisis today, given that we were just talking about the just-in-time supply chain, which was a beautiful idea, but has now really introduced some weaknesses into our society. And maybe want to explain that a little bit more. What are some recent examples that have caught your attention?
Yeah, first off, everybody loves a good pirate story,
Exactly.
right? Pirates of the Caribbean is really popular for that exact reason. The term maritime crisis has really evolved significantly. While piracy and pollution events still draw headlines, contemporary maritime crisis often involves systemic disruptions that affect global commerce, infrastructure resilience, or public safety. A maritime crisis today could range from kinetic, such as vessel collisions, groundings, or fires, structural, such as cyberattacks on port operating systems, prolonged labor strikes, or cascading supply chain failures caused by weather events. One compelling example is the motor vessel Ever Given that was stuck in the Suez Canal. That was in 2021, halted approximately 12% of global trade for nearly a week. The economic losses were estimated in the billions, and the impact reverberated for months. More recently, I've worked with an incident in the Columbia River where the motor vessel Daphne had an incident in which containers loaded with lithium-ion batteries collapsed in the hold during the storm. Fireworks were stored above deck, compounding the risk. Though this event occurred far from a major port, the salvage planning, stakeholder coordination, and risk mitigation required were extensive and illustrative of the kinds of complex maritime crises emerging today. Modern crises also include non-physical threats, such as ransomware attacks that paralyze port operations, or data integrity failures that affect cargo tracking and customs processes.
Yeah, that was already 4 years ago. That's amazing. I was thinking it was just a couple of years ago, but it's already been 4 years for the Suez Canal. But, okay, so when a crisis strikes at sea, as you mentioned, or even in the port, we often hear about multiple agencies stepping in, the ports, the critical infrastructure. There are multiple, not only state, but federal agencies involved, even international organizations. But it's rarely just one group, like I was just saying. It's everybody from port authorities, Coast Guard, and even international bodies, the IMO. But could you break down how this patchwork of governance actually works, how it sort of layers together, and why it's so challenging to align them, especially in these more politicized, high-stakes environments?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the governance structure for maritime crises is really highly decentralized and inherently complex. It involves actors from municipal, national, and international levels. At the local level, port authorities manage infrastructure, lease agreements, and logistics coordination. They often serve as the first responders to disruptions affecting terminal operations. Nationally, Coast Guards or maritime administrations are responsible for safety, security, and environmental enforcement. In the United States, the U.S. Coast Guard acts as the federal on-scene coordinator for oil and hazardous material incidents, while also managing different maritime security zones and safety zones depending on the incidents. Internationally, the International Maritime Organization, or the IMO, sets state safety and environmental standards for vessels, while treaties such as SOLAS and MARPOL shape vessel construction, cargo transport, and emergency preparedness. The challenge, though, lies in aligning these entities, especially during time-sensitive, multi-causal events, cascading events even. Differing authorities, priorities, and risk perceptions can create bottlenecks in decision-making. For example, while a port authority might prioritize reopening berth space, a national agency might be focused on environmental protection or public health. International stakeholders may emphasize vessel compliance and continuity of trade. The lack of shared information systems, differing terminology of each organization, and unaligned contingency planning frameworks further complicate matters. Success, though, depends on pre-established coordination mechanisms, clear command structures, and mutual trust, which is the key element. I have some colleagues at the University of Antwerp that are researching trust in government agencies, and it's really eye-opening to see how important it really is. And that trust, though, in this case, is built through joint exercises, port security committees, and shared crisis communication channels.
Let's stay on that topic for just a second, because my next question would really be about, okay, so we talked about the layers of governance and the institutional frameworks that they might have, or the working assumptions that they might have about an incident and who's doing what and where, for example. What really happens on the ground when a huge storm hits? Is there a gap? I guess this is really the core of my question. Is there a gap between all of these frameworks and these things we've implemented as an institution, which are a positive thing, right? But there's always going to be a gap on the ground. And so what really happens when that huge storm does hit? And what causes a gap? And then how do professionals bridge that gap? And you mentioned trust as well, right? So there's got to be some decision making that require elements of trust to be able to change plans on the ground as events change, right?
Yeah, there's often a significant gap between theoretical frameworks and the operational realities that are faced during maritime crises, right? So, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, for example, is an excellent strategic document that outlines 4 priority areas: understanding disaster risk, strengthening governance, investing in resilience, and enhancing disaster preparedness. However, translating those priorities into practical port specific action plans is really challenging. And several factors contribute to that gap. The first is many ports, particularly small and medium sized ones, lack the resources to fully implement complex resilience frameworks. Second, risk assessments are often incomplete or fail to incorporate compound and cascading threats, such as a storm that disrupts electricity, which in turn disables port security systems and causes a cyber breach. Third, human factors such as turnover, lack of training, or operating in institutional silos. Those can limit the utility of high-level plans in a dynamic situation. To bridge this gap, however, professionals need to operationalize resilience. That means conducting realistic tabletop and full-scale exercises, integrating port emergency plans with municipal and national systems, and developing performance-based indicators that help decision makers track recovery in real time. Bridging theory/practice divide also involves fostering culture of adaptive learning, where after-action reports lead to tangible changes in policy and procedure, rather than, as we know, most after-action reports sit idle on the shelf.
Well, let's talk about the impact assessment then, because you mentioned a number of different variables. And so ports just don't handle cargo, right? And they employ large communities. You even said that they're small, medium, large ports, and then sometimes become vital lifelines for humanitarian aid. So, how do you balance the urgency to get the global trade back online, which is an economic imperative, with the needs of local residents or relief operations when a big disruption hits these areas?
Yeah, balancing the imperatives of global trade continuity with the humanitarian and economic needs of local communities is probably one of the most ethically and operationally complex aspects of port recovery. Ports are often the economic nucleus of their regions, employing thousands of workers, generating tax revenues, and sustaining local businesses. However, simultaneously, ports are indispensable for delivering relief supplies and coordinating evacuations in disaster-prone areas. The initial focus might be on life safety or environmental stabilization and restoration of critical infrastructure. Once that baseline is achieved, the recovery phase must include prioritized reopening of terminals that support both humanitarian operations and time-sensitive trade flows. This requires close coordination with emergency management agencies, customs authorities, and some NGOs. To navigate this tension effectively, ports and port officials should pre-establish prioritization frameworks that identify which cargo types and which terminals serve critical lifeline functions. Public-private coordination bodies can serve as neutral conveners to ensure that recovery plans are equitable and data-informed, and that everybody has a seat at the table. So you bring in the entire group, and then the group could work towards the solution versus a top-down approach. Incorporating social vulnerability indexes and local economic impact models into these plans while the group is working out where to put stuff, it ensures the recovery process supports both macroeconomic and community-level resilience.
When I hear you sort of discuss the way that these frameworks will work together and how we have to plan around communities and economic impact and longer term resilience, I, being from the state of Texas, always think about how hurricane season is a known thing every single year. And we know it's a seasonal event. There's also monsoons in other areas of the world, but there's even like holiday shipping, right? So if really all our goods, 90% are shipped around the world and it's all coming in during the holiday season, it creates these are things, these are events we can anticipate, plan for, and we can look at these sort of predictable surges. But what steps do actual maritime leaders, I guess I would say, what do they need to make to, or what do they need to do in order to have successful strategies for both just the timing and the criticality of these operations and really add in these sort of seasonal factors? And we know that the hurricanes are coming. We know there's peak seasons in terms of cargo. And so what is the framework of the state of mind in terms of what they're looking at?
Yeah, so anticipating those seasonal surges and high risk periods is a core function of the maritime risk governance structure. Maritime leaders leverage historical data, predictive analytics, and climatological forecasts to develop operational playbooks or checklists tailored to local risk profiles. In hurricane-prone areas, many ports implement port readiness conditions or other protocols that escalate through defined levels as a storm approaches, activating emergency operation centers, halting cargo movements, and coordinating with anchorage authorities or shipping lines and things like that. During holiday shipping peaks or agricultural export seasons, ports often adjust staffing levels, extend gate hours, and collaborate with inland logistics providers to manage the surge in container volumes. In certain jurisdictions, vessels may be rescheduled or prioritized for berthing based on cargo criticality or perishability. These preemptive measures reduce congestion, improve safety, and maintain economic continuity. One particularly successful strategy I've observed throughout my work involves integrated stakeholder briefings that include port authorities, terminal operators, shipping lines, emergency managers. I think that's the key, is a lot of the times we talk about ports in the silo, but we need to bring in local, state, and provincial emergency managers into the discussion. And of course, labor unions, because without labor union in the U.S., products don't move. And these meetings allow for synchronization of operations, the establishment of contingency routes in the event that the priority route is unavailable, and the identification of at-risk commodities, because an at-risk commodity might mean something different to a different group. Proactive coordination rather than reactive crisis response could significantly reduce system strain and improve adaptive capacity.
So let's shift over a bit into sort of the cyber domain, because with ports increasingly becoming digitized, right? With cranes, scheduling, container tracking, what's your take on the rising cyber threats? Have you encountered situations where a digital failure or a breach has caused a disruption with physical results?
Yeah, so the maritime sector, it's undergoing a digital transformation, and it's got significant gains in efficiency, safety, and visibility. However, this digitalization comes with corresponding cybersecurity vulnerabilities. The attack surface is expanded as port equipment, vessel navigation systems, and cargo databases become interconnected via the Internet of Things and cloud-based platforms. Cyber incidents such as the NotPetya attack on Maersk in 2017, which disrupted port operations and cargo tracking globally, illustrate how a single point of failure can cascade across systems. I've researched other ports where ransomware encrypted vital operating systems, which rendered them non-functional for days. The economic impact in these cases is comparable to physical disruptions because it's cyber turns physical, and that's the most interesting portion to me personally. But the loss of throughput, diversion of vessels, contractual penalties, and reputational damage are all real in cyber attacks and cyber events. Addressing this threat requires ports to invest, right, in both technological defenses and institutional resilience. And the institutional resilience is probably the port that's getting the less look. Technological defenses is very popular because there's a lot of companies that can help with that. Cyber risk, though, must be integrated into continuity of operations planning, or COOP, and cyber incident response should be drilled with the same rigor as that of an oil spill or a maritime vessel fire scenario. The future of maritime resilience really depends on not only stronger seawalls and response teams, but also on robust firewalls and backup protocols and workforce cyber literacy.
So, okay, say that there is a digital or a cyber event that leads into a physical sort of disruption in operation. This could be classified as like a major incident. So let's say there's a major incident and the port reopens, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's fully recovered. And so what indicators or signs do you personally look for to confirm that a port is genuinely back on its feet and not just working at half capacity?
Port reopening is a symbolic and operational milestone, but it's not always synonymous with recovery. To evaluate whether a port is fully recovered, I assess quantitative and qualitative indicators. Key among those are container throughput metrics, vessel turnaround times, and intermodal connectivity. If cargo is arriving but not being cleared efficiently, or if labor shortages are limiting crane operations, the port is functionally impaired, despite being technically open. Other critical indicators include landside logistics flow. So those are trucks queuing for hours due to gate inefficiencies. Are rail connections restored and operating within normal parameters? Importantly, I also look at stakeholder sentiment. Are shippers rerouting vessels to alternative ports due to confidence gaps? Are port workers reporting safe or incomplete working conditions? In my academic work at the University of Antwerp, I've been working on a port recovery index. So I've been looking to formalize these indicators into a composite score that integrates physical capacity, labor availability, governance response, and economic throughput. Recovery should be evidence-based and data-driven, not just merely performative.
Now, you did just build a course on maritime port recovery and maritime crisis management with Crisis Lab, and your course does go into managing these types of disruptions from the strategic level down to, say, more practical salvage operations. So for someone that's relatively new to this field, how does that particular course or that program help bridge the gap between these academic concepts that you're talking about and then also the practical realities we've been discussing?
Yeah, I'm really stoked about the course. I'm looking forward to everyone taking it. The course is intentionally designed to serve as a bridge between the theoretical understanding and operational readiness. A lot of times that's right where the gap is. By grounding students in the fundamental frameworks of disaster resilience, including the Sendai framework, the principles of critical infrastructure protection, and maritime risk governance, then we quickly move into applied learning, analyzing real-world case studies and looking at different scenario-based situations that the students can use to simulate or to evaluate complex maritime crises. The participants are exposed to a full spectrum of disruption, from acute incidents like vessel fires or cyber breaches to chronic stressors, such as climate-induced sea level rise. We integrate some technical skills, i.e. salvage planning and incident command, with systems thinking, like stakeholder mapping and interagency coordination. So whether a student comes from engineering policy or operations background, the course emphasizes translational knowledge, how to move from abstract resiliency goals to actionable recovery planning. This goal is to equip emerging leaders with the skills and insights necessary to navigate the complexities of modern maritime disruptions with clarity, competence, and coordination.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot for that. And so the last question I have is looking forward. We often discuss emerging issues and predict a little bit about the future and threat across that risk landscape. And so what do you see are the emerging issues? Maybe it's more extreme weather, offshore wind farms, or advanced automations as these emerging issues that are coming up within your sector. Do you believe they will redefine how we manage a maritime crisis in the coming years?
Yeah, great question. This is one of my favorites to kind of look ahead. But several converging trends are reshaping the risk landscape for ports and maritime systems. Climate adaptation is paramount. Ports are increasingly vulnerable to rising sea levels, intensifying storm surges, and extreme heats. These hazards threaten not only infrastructure, but also continuity of port operations. Ports need to invest in adaptive infrastructure. Potentials could be elevated terminals, green energy transitions, loading berths, as well as scenario modeling and community-based adaptation planning. Offshore wind farms represent another emerging frontier. These installations require new vessel types, a new way to carry wind blades. We're seeing that in the Columbia River, where sometimes they stack them too high, and it presents a hazard to navigation because the river pilots can't actually see out the window as they're making tight turns in the inland navigable waterway. So maintenance protocols also, and then potential new maritime traffic patterns, because they're coming from different origin points, and maybe we're getting new vessels into each maritime system. So each port is going to see vessels that maybe they haven't seen before. They also raise novel emergency planning considerations, including how to conduct rescue or firefighting operations in turbine fields and on vessels. This has similarities and parallels with lithium-ion batteries. As the world goes electric, the firefighting technology and procedures to fight a lithium-ion battery on a vessel, either at sea or at a port, just haven't caught up yet. So we're trying to create ways to make that safer. The intersection of renewable energy and maritime governance is going to be a defining challenge of the coming decade. And then lastly, automation and AI are introducing both opportunity and risk. Fully automated terminals promise increased efficiency, but also decrease flexibility during crisis. Human oversight and manual override capabilities must be preserved. AI models used for predictive maintenance, cargo flow, or threat detection must be stress tested for robustness under anomalous conditions. And together, these trends demand a multidisciplinary approach, one that will integrate engineering, policy, technology, and social equity to design maritime systems that are both high-performing and deeply resilient.
Yeah, thanks, James. I really appreciate you looking into your crystal ball a little bit and seeing some of the emerging things that we're going to have to deal with. It's always fascinating to talk to people like yourself from different domains and unpack the downstream effects of some of these big policy changes, whether it's investing in renewable energy or the shift to electric and lithium batteries and the impact, not only environmentally, but the way we manage a crisis. All of it is super fascinating. So thanks a lot for being here today on the Crisis Lab podcast and joining us and unpacking what you've already developed with us in the course and also some of your perspectives about the emerging trends. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks. It was my pleasure.
All right. And that's it for our podcast today. For anybody who would like some more information about James and the course that he has with Crisis Lab, please head over to crisislab.io and you can find out more information there. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next time.